Hi everyone, this is Laura. If you're a podcast listener, there is a podcast I'd like to introduce you to. Best of the Left is a curated podcast by Jay Tomlinson. Every week, he culls through all sorts of content from across the progressive pod universe around a particular topic. The Laura Flanders Show is often included. Jay's compilation is a great way to keep abreast of all that's coming out from the progressive pod world, and a way to discover new voices and podcasts that might interest you. Finding and sifting through all of that can be daunting in this digital age, like a needle in a haystack. Considering how much is out there, Jay is doing us a real favor. He really hones in on the heart of the matter and gives us a single topic seen from a variety of angles. Like the Laura Flanders Show, you can follow Best of the Left for free anywhere you get your podcasts. And let us know what you think by posting a comment in our social media feed. Now on with this week's show. 1, 2, 3.
The following is a Laura Flanders Show audio exclusive.
We're starting another year with inequality gaping. Over the last decade, the median net worth of the top 10 billionaires in the world has nearly tripled. In fact, all but 2 of the top 10 wealthiest are centi-billionaires. It's inconceivable to most Americans who are for the first time earning less than their parents. Economic mobility is on the decline. But regardless of the facts, the entertainment industry continues to serve up American dream, rags to riches for everybody stories. And no company does that more energetically than Disney. When the granddaughter of one of the founders of that company received an invitation from a Disney employee to look into the quality of life for workers at Disney's flagship theme park, Disneyland, Abigail Disney found that some cast members, as they're called, were earning 2/2000th of the earnings of CEO Bob Iger. Working full-time, they were barely getting by. She thought that was wrong. She wrote to Iger, testified in Congress, and ultimately did what she does. She made a film. The result is a very personal documentary, The American Dream and Other Fairy Tales, which calls out inequality and the policies and values that create it, not only at Disney, but across the business world. Abby Disney is an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker, an activist with the group The Patriotic Millionaires, and the granddaughter of Roy Disney, who co-founded the company with Walt. The film, co-directed with Kathleen Hughes, is available for streaming now, and I am so happy to welcome Abigail Disney to our screens and to our show. And I want to start by having you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you want to be identified. I noticed, for example, that when you testified in Congress, you were clear to put Dr. Disney, presumably because you wanted them to, or at least to sort of shake up their expectations.
Well, that was Carolyn Maloney's staff that put doctor on there. I tend not to use it just because, it doesn't have anything to do with anything I do, but I have a PhD in English literature. So when somebody called me Ms. Disney, I kind of went out of my way to point at the doctor just because it felt sort of disrespectful. And I did get a fair amount of disrespect from the Republican side on that hearing. But I'm a filmmaker. I only became a filmmaker in my 40s, so I'm a relative newbie to it. But I have been working as an activist all of my adult life, thinking about women's issues and inequality and race and all the central problems, America has.
Yeah, I mean, I ask because it must be quite something to be a Disney in this world. How is it?
The only word for it is weird, because it's a very weird thing to drive around and see your name pop up everywhere you look, and walk through the airport and see one Mickey Mouse T-shirt after another and so forth. If you're looking for Mickey, it turns out he is absolutely everywhere, and if he's attached to your last name, then you just can't lose him.
Have you always had a sense of kind of corporate responsibility or responsibility around the name?
Yes, I always have had a sense. I think, when we were very young, we used to go, to the park, as we called it, with my grandfather or with my parents. And usually there was an occasion that we were going there for, like a parade was starting or the Small World ride was opening. That's one of my best memories. And so we would be dressed to the nines, and we would be on our very best behavior. And so I think the place we were always aware that we had a special relationship to this place and that everybody else really loved it. And then, as I got older, I got interested in other people's responsibilities and other corporations and other things going on. It kind of left some space between myself and the company in terms of my activism and my thinking about social justice. But I kind of couldn't stay away from it forever because it was just this gaping, problem in the center of everything.
In 2018 is really when things took a shift. What happened?
Yeah, in 2018, I got a Facebook message. There had been a series of stories, as there very often are, about workers at Disneyland not being well treated, but it had really started to pop up much more often. And so I had allowed myself to kind of not really look at the problem for a long time. I figured, that wasn't my job. I would do other things. But then I got this very direct message from a worker at Disneyland on Facebook. And I actually never look at Facebook messages. I have no idea why I looked at his message. But once I'd read it, it kind of felt like I couldn't unread it. And I couldn't be in relationship suddenly with this individual person. And when it became personal, then I just felt like I needed to follow what my sense of responsibility was telling me to do, which was to go out there and talk to people.
Well, what was so striking, and you see it in the film, is the love so many of those employees have or had or kind of want to have to the whole Disney brand and their experience. That part of it was super moving, I thought.
I think it's really moving, and it's one of my favorite things about the company, although it's deeply painful to talk about, to be honest, because I also know that that's one of the reasons that the company gets away with paying people so poorly, that they kind of use that as a way of keep stringing people on and promising people better things later if they will only try hard enough.
You found that many of the workers, including the guy who wrote to you, Ralph, were barely getting by. And there's a scene in the film where you talk to employees and ask them how many are on food stamps, how many have been living in their, have people they know have lived in their car. Is there one story that stands out to you even now, perhaps that didn't make it in the film or that has developed since?
I mean, the first one that popped into my head isn't in the film. I wish it were in the film, but it just kills me. I mean, when I go there as a Disney family member, I get treated really well and nicely, and because of the love the people who work for the park have for my family and for the company. And so the folks in the character outfits tend to be especially enthusiastic, and whoever's in the Winnie the Pooh costume, whatever, I really do think they cast people for their personalities, and it comes through even though they don't talk. And there was a woman who played Winnie the Pooh for many, many years, I think 8, 9, 10 years or something like that, 6 days a week, who died in her car. And that was really a galvanizing moment for a lot of the folks that I spoke to, because the wrongness of this was all concentrated in this one moment.
Breaks your heart. So you go off on an investigation as to how did things get to be this way. And would I be right in saying that you began with a sense that it wasn't like that in your grandfather's time?
Yeah, and I remember my grandfather. I'm and we all, maybe not all of us, but many of us look up to our grandfathers and admire them and think of them as these perfect people. My grandfather was actually a perfect person.
Mine too.
He wasn't. He definitely had his flaws, but he was a decent person, and he really, really, really cared about individual people. He cared. I think this is where I got it from. He cared about the person he was interacting with, not the position that person held. And so he didn't really value, the CEO any more highly than he valued somebody who was sweeping the sidewalk. And that was a value that he instilled in people who worked for the company. That was why he always picked up garbage when he was in the park. And that it's still a tradition at Disney that everybody picks up garbage, except now management doesn't. But I could be wrong about that. There could be elements of management that do it. But when I suggested that the CEO pick up garbage, everybody in the room laughed. So I'm pretty sure the CEO doesn't anymore. But anyway, he interacted with people as people and not positions. And he felt really strongly that running a company was about taking care of the people around you. That's rank paternalism. I recognize that. But it's better than the soulless kind of treating people like cogs in a machine that we have now.
We did a story not so long ago in Morgantown, West Virginia, about a pharmaceutical plant that was called Mylar Pharmaceuticals. And it was headed by a man, founded by a man, Milan Pushkin, Pushkar, whose name you see all over Morgantown. He made plenty of money. He hired lots of people. It's a big company. It's the big employer in town. But he didn't stop there. He invested in healthcare and sports stadia and all sorts of things. And something shifted. The new owners, the new operators are not that way. And everybody said something changed. And they had very similar stories to the people, the stories that your Disney employees shared. What did you find that change to have been caused by?
Well, something that that happened with the shift in Mylar is the same as what happened at Disneyland, which was that kind of a new ethos rose up, and not from nowhere. New ethoses don't just kind of fall from the air. There was a conscious movement afoot in the 70s and 80s among a certain kind of corporate interest, namely the managements and the boards and the kind of the ruling class of corporate America. They wanted to change the way we understood corporations and their role in public life and where individuals fit into the picture around corporations. And they were people who genuinely believed America's best and most important interest was their corporate community. And so they wanted to change people into people. They wanted to change America into a place where people put the corporation ahead of themselves, people put themselves ahead of others, and an idea that you would leave any money on the table, any opportunity unexploited, just because people matter, was seen as ridiculous and childish and naive. And I can go through 1,000 other words for what it is, but it just became not done. And so there are still a handful of companies that operate in the way that my grandfather operated Disney, but they are in the minority. And what happens is, even when they last, and even when they survive in the context of this incredibly cutthroat environment, they'll get bought up by a private equity company eventually, or exited by their owners in some way. And then, the sharks will descend on the carcass and turn it into the same company everybody else is working for. So there was it was like the well had been poisoned by a rethinking of what individual people mean and what value corporations have socially.
Heather McGhee, the economist who we've had on our program, talks about the role that race played in all of this and what it was that shifted things in the 1960s, when we went from a period perhaps in the 30s where government was expanding opportunity for the white working class to a period where government was actually trying to enforce civil rights laws and maybe shift the status quo a bit to become more inclusive of women and people of color and immigrants.
Right. And every time you've seen that in American history, every time you've seen some kind of movement toward something a little more just, you see the ruling class revolt and use whatever means it has at its disposal to put that genie back in the bottle. And certainly in the civil rights era, things shifted. The government certainly shifted in terms of who it was defending, whose interests it was defending. And as that happened, not coincidentally, a great suspicion of governments and what they are for and what role they should play in public life also shifted among white Americans who saw themselves losing power. It's not as simple as a bunch of white people sitting around a table saying, "Oh my gosh, the Black people are going to have power now." It was a collective consciousness that shifted, and the reason that race is the American Achilles heel. It has always been the Achilles heel. And one of the things that Heather talks about in that book that is so important is that we were all vulnerable. This hardy, healthy economy that my grandfather thrived in, which had a more collective spirit and which was more fair-minded about how it treated people, also had this fatal characteristic, which was that it tolerated the oppression and suppression of large swaths of the American public. It abided a level of cruelty and heartlessness. And so when the cruelty and the heartlessness started to grow like a virus inside of the body politic, there was no stopping it, because there was always such a high tolerance for cruelty. So what she says in the film that's really important is what's happening for white Americans isn't new. They are living the reality that Black and brown Americans have lived all along. And if we had cared about their well-being, we might have been better equipped to fight this challenge that came from above.
The point is so important that it wasn't just that the generation of your grandfather and his brother was kindler, gentler. As you say, maybe the ethos was different, the culture was a bit different, maybe what came before them was more familiar to them, and they were following a tradition in a sense. But it was also the fact that government was keeping people in check, along with unions. And the unions played a huge role in all of this, as they're playing today. But the power of unions has shrunk tremendously. So we have something like 6% of private industry workers unionized, way down from where it was even when you and I were born. Talk about how that then enabled these corporations to get government off their backs when it comes to everything you're talking about, regulations on the environment, on taxes, on wages, and the wage disparities between the top and the lowest workers.
I think that the assault on the union movement was a very thoughtful, strategic move. And if you remember Ronald Reagan's election, he ran in support of the air traffic controllers. Actually, he made public statements during his campaign supporting the air traffic controllers. But in February, after his inauguration, so less than a month after he was inaugurated, he did one of the most famous things he did, which was to fire the entire union. And he didn't just fire the entire union. He made it so that nobody in that union could ever hold a government job again. So he didn't just crush that union, he destroyed everyone in it. And it was important that he do it that way. And there are letters, if you read, I think it's Kim Fine's book, The Invisible Hands. She quotes a CEO in a letter saying, "Oh, we all knew that was a message. We all knew what Ronald Reagan was trying to communicate to us when he did that. It was a green light to go after unions, and that government wouldn't be representing their interests anymore." And they accomplished so much by doing that, because it's not just that corporations had a less effective opponent when they went to the bargaining table and ultimately didn't have to go to the bargaining table anymore. And it wasn't just that government wasn't sticking up for workers' interests. And so things like minimum wages stopped increasing and worker protection started to disappear. But voters from unions were not getting their union dues, and therefore were less able to contribute to progressive candidacies and protect politicians who would go in there and fight for unions. And it destroyed the collective spirit. It destroyed the idea that when you show up for work, you show up for work shoulder to shoulder with a bunch of other people who are your peers, who have a shared interest with you, and that therefore collective bargaining was the best way for you to represent your own interests in the workplace. So it splintered everyone. And absent collective bargaining, we are all subject to the tender mercies of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. Collective bargaining is the only way workers have to democratically represent their own interests in the workplace.
So talk about a trifecta. You kind of disable the unions, you discredit government, you help shift the culture through investing in a whole lot of media, and voila, you have this ethos change that you just talked about. I mean, there are individuals play a role, no question. Walt famously did go after communists, testified in the House Un-American Affairs Committee. I mean, there's no question individuals play a role, but we do tend to tell these stories as stories of individuals. And what you do so brilliantly in the film is to emphasize, yes, there's individuals in this picture, but it's not just them. I want to ask you a bit about our media coverage of this story, because you just mentioned Elon Musk and Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. Isn't what we're talking about just capitalism? The great unspoken word?
No, actually. And even if you resurrected Adam Smith today, he would look at what we have and say, my goodness, what have you done? I really know that what we have it's the difference between a religion and the fundamentalist version of that religion. And the fundamentalist version of anything is a clinging to a handful of tenets and precepts at the expense of the spirit of the thing that you're supporting. And so we live under a regime of fundamentalist masculinity, frankly. We live under a regime of fundamentalist capitalism. And so what got drained out of capitalism, and even Milton Friedman, the patron saint of this form of capitalism, himself said, within reason, within the confines of public mores and values. And so we just kind of raced to the other side of the pendulum. And not that what we had before was, all the way out at 9 o'clock, but we're over here at 3. And what is holding it here is, a now very moneyed class. And now that Citizens United, such an investment in taking off all the guardrails on how money could play a role in politics has caused all this money and these moneyed interests to flood into the space to now protect their already substantial advantage.
This is the Laura Flanders Show. I'm Laura. My guest is Abigail Disney. She's an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker, philanthropist, activist, and the host of the podcast All Ears with Abigail Disney. Her most recent documentary is The American Dream and Other Fairy Tales, produced by Fork Films, a company she and Jeannie Whittaker founded. The documentary calls out inequality and the policies and values that create it across the business world these days, and it's the subject of today's show. Next, we delve into what the shift was that led to the diminishing power of workers in the U.S. in the late 20th century, how race has played a role in shifting the status quo, and more. Head to our archives at lauraflanders.org for more of our reporting on changemakers and forward thinkers creating the solutions of tomorrow today. This show airs on public television and community radio stations across the country. All the details on the stations carrying the show and how to subscribe are at lauraflanders.org. Be sure to subscribe to our newsletter while you're there to receive information on all our web exclusives. Stay tuned as my conversation continues with Abigail Disney, granddaughter of the co-founder of the company. But first, here's Black Froze Black Gold, All You Zombies Dig the Luminosity by Burnt Sugar, the orchestra chamber from their 20th anniversary mixtapes Greatest Skiznits, Volume 3.
One day they come singing your praises. Next day, snatching your wages. So confused, stole your blues. Got cut loader to tell you the news. Hid them blues behind robes and popes. Soldier blues out for deuces and dope. But beyond these gates your ship awaits if they only knew no slaves to view. But beyond these gates your ship awaits if they only knew no slaves to view. Nothing but rebels on this stinking trail.
So the question is, what do we do about it? I mean, you and I may disagree about how capitalism functions. I read most of that Thomas Piketty book, and it seemed to suggest that this is inevitable, that with incremental growth, or rather really exponential growth, you are going to get these huge disparities between rich and poor. We're there now with this huge portion of all global wealth in the hands of basically a handful of people. Is it shiftable? I mean, what can we do?
Well, I mean, I think that the first thing that has to happen is we have to find a way to get money out of politics. And that sounds like an impossible task, except that we still have somewhat of a democracy in place. We still find politicians like Bernie Sanders succeeding by raising money from lots and lots of individuals who give a little instead of a handful of individuals who give a lot. And as long as we still have the shreds of that democracy, we still have a hope of, for instance, passing laws to protect us from the Citizens United decision and constraining money in politics. And look, we just had a pretty good election in 22. Oh my gosh.
Where are we?
And I hope we're going to have another good election in 2024, and maybe we can start to reverse the tide. So that's the first thing. And once you've done that, you can start to put in place the other guardrails that have been taken down. So, there are hybrid systems around the world, social democracies, quasi-socialist systems, capitalism sort of married to a very vigorous government intervention that could get us back to where we need to be. I mean, I've been to Denmark, and it doesn't feel like a socialist hellhole to me. It feels like a pretty great place to live, and I don't see any people with schizophrenia sleeping on doorsteps. And I do think that not the huge percentage of their population is in prison. There are ways and ways to understand this, but we have not brought government to bear on the ways in which capitalism can be constrained. Thomas Piketty is right. What he says is, if you predicate your central social enterprise around the idea that there must be year-over-year growth ad infinitum, then you are eventually going to reach a limit that can't be sustained. But the growth rate that we've been insisting on over the last 30 years or so has been in the 6 and 7 and 12 and 14%. And that's a highway to hell for everybody, ultimately. And if you read about the doomsday preppers who are at the luxury end of things, even their best assumptions about how they could make a life for themselves after whatever apocalypse they seem to think is coming sounds hellish to me. So everybody goes to hell in this scenario. But a 2% growth rate, can be accommodated over the long term if you have a healthy, vigorous government pushing back over time on the excesses and on the ways in which that growth rate is eating into our basic fundamental resources and rights.
I remember talking to venture capitalist Nick Hanauer, who I think you know also, who said soon after the financial crash that he thought, the rich should watch out, that there were going to be people coming with pitchforks because the way things were going wasn't good for the social fabric, wasn't good for the environment, wasn't good for any of it. I haven't seen those pitchforks, but I have seen a few more labor strikes than ever, a huge spike in labor activity in 2022. Where do you see signs of hope? We've also done episodes on the show about guaranteed minimum incomes, cash payments for poor people in, at the city level, all sorts of efforts being experimented with. Anything you're particularly excited about out there, Abby?
Well, first of all, there have been pitchforks, and they were there on January 6th, right? So
I guess those weren't the ones I was thinking of.
Yes, but they were pitchforks with an analysis that had misdirected their energies. But what they have fundamentally over there on the far right wing is an anti-corporate analysis. And when Ron DeSantis pushed back on Disney and talked about woke, when you hear about woke capitalism, that is the sound of their anti-corporate ethos, because they know they can't hold people forever unless they speak up about what is so plainly happening to their own people, right? So they have used and misdirected the anti-corporate impulse that is a fundamental populist impulse, right? And set us against each other and set us against the government in all sorts of ways. And on top of it, they armed us up. And they highly destabilized every nook and cranny of American culture right now. So it was never going to be as straightforward as a bunch of pitchforks in front of the castle. It was always going to be something much more misdirected and complicated. What am I excited about? I'm excited about a crop of young politicians who came up in this last set of elections. There are a whole bunch of freshmen in the Congress right now who are incredibly articulate about thinking differently about the way that you talk about the injustices and inequities. Because what I'm hearing in their language is a lot of, I'm not interested in pointing my fingers laterally at whose fault it is. I'm interested in looking forward with you, regardless of the side of the aisle you're on, about how we can address these problems together. There's an enormous amount of shared interest between the far right and the far left wing in this country, enormous. That's actually scary to me because it can be terribly misdirected. But with some great leadership, it can also amount to people recognizing that they have a shared interest in coming together and pushing back on the very, very gross misuse of power that is now occurring by corporations in this country. The other thing that makes me excited is what I hear from my Rebecca Henderson, who's in the film, who teaches business at Harvard. The crop of incoming first-year business students is entirely different than it was 10 years ago. There are a lot of people showing up for business school, not because they want to make $1 million or $1 billion now. $1 million isn't what it used to be, but because they want to see how they can make lives of meaning and value by changing the way it's done. And that's the part that gives me hope. I was just talking about a business that I've been hearing about. They use upcycled materials and they train people and blah, blah, blah. Circular economies, restorative economies. There's an enormous amount of creative thinking happening, and that's where the action is.
Well, we report on a lot of it on this program. I look forward to hearing suggestions from you. One of the things that some of our guests have said is that it's much easier to talk about raising wages and narrowing that gap between the highest and lowest paid than it is to claw back money through taxes. And you testified in front of the House Finance Committee about the need to increase taxes, and the patriotic millionaires, or maybe your billionaires, are forceful about increasing taxes. But it does seem to me that might be the hardest thing to do, although, of course, I'm for it.
That is the hardest thing to do. It's going to be the hardest thing to do. And it's the most necessary because we can close the gap a little with wages. But the real problem isn't wage inequality. The real problem, the persistent problem, is wealth inequality. And that starts with, for instance, the way wealth is taxed. I own. That's what I do for money, is own. I sit on my couch owning things. And, people show up for work every day and pay a higher effective tax rate on the money that comes into them because they work than I pay on the money that comes to me because I sit on my couch and own. So that's a very fundamental failure of applying our moral systems and our basic shared values to the tax code. And a tax code is an expression of norms and values. It's nothing else but that. So we really need to elect people who will fight to help empower the IRS to actually collect the taxes that are owed them, first of all, because you're more likely to be audited if you're low income than if you have a lot of money. So let's start auditing some of the people who are making a game out of evading taxes. Let's change the code so it tax work at a more favorable rate than ownership. And let's think about a wealth tax. I think the wealth tax is the only way we're actually going to make a difference. And then a high income tax at the top bracket, like one that discourages you from wanting to make $2 million a year, because nobody needs $2 million a year. So a punitive top end. My grandfather became a very wealthy man, paying upwards of 70 to 75% on his income.
Bernie Sanders said that he ran on, well, among other things, there should be no billionaires.
I agree, because honestly, if you can't live on $999 million, you've got so many bigger problems than just that last $1 million. Honestly, if you really stop to consider what $1 billion is, it is just a sickening amount of money. Yeah. And much of the money that a billionaire like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, who's not as billionaire as he used to be because he did a stupid thing, but much of the money is on paper.
Yeah.
But on paper is something, if you have access to great advice, to banking systems that favor you, you can turn that into real money pretty easily. So we really need to think long and hard about, do I want Jeff Bezos to spend a lot of money on philanthropy, or do I want him to just pay people fairly and make less money to begin with and still be a very wealthy man? I don't understand why that's even a choice.
Yeah. Were you ever inclined, as I watched your interviewing these folks, did you ever feel to you that you should just give them your money?
Yes, of course, of course. I feel that every day, and I've felt that every day since I was very young. And I have struggled with that for a long time. In the past, one of the reasons I never did that was fear. I'm not going to tell you I'm a saint. Fear and selfishness and a sense that I would never last. And as I got deeper and deeper into my activism, my philanthropy, and my thinking about this, it came to me that, what I have is a drop in the bucket as compared to what needs to happen. And I could help a lot of individual people over the short term, or even over their lifetimes. I could do that. But I wouldn't change anything. And so there would just be other people who would flood into the space that they had vacated by rising on the ladder. And I'm worried about the spot at the bottom of the ladder, which is filled with people who will never have a chance to rise. If I don't use my resources to change the circumstances, the values, and the structures that led me to have these kinds of advantages, then I've wasted it.
Structural change is what I'm hearing. And I hear you loud and clear. Let's come back to you and to a vision for the future. Because if you call the American dream, the idea that you can rise from rags to riches, that there's mobility in our economy, a fantasy tale, as you do in the top of the film, I don't know whether you go so far as to say the dream is dead, but it does leave me wondering what would be a dream worthy of this century, worthy of the 21st century, knowing all that we know about what, as you mentioned, this endless pursuit of individual wealth and growth has, where it's brought us.
Yeah, I think our brains have been sort of infected by a series of visual metaphors. And I think about that ladder metaphor. How many people fit on a ladder? And when you rise, can you bring anyone with you? And who are you leaving behind? And where are you rising to exactly? So that I don't know that was the dream necessarily, that we call the American dream, but it has been in the last half century what has filled into the vacant space that was formed by an abandoning of an old dream. And the old dream, it started during Reconstruction, and then you can hear it in the progressive era, in the language of people there, and during the Roosevelt's era. And yeah, now I'm talking the kind of thing that would make right-wing people completely head explode. But this is the truth of it. We used to share a dream about shared accomplishment, shared not luxury, but shared success, shared well-being. And where if someone over there was doing really poorly, that affected me. I couldn't pretend that it had nothing to do with me. And that is still alive and well in America. There have always been these competing fantasies of America. There was a fantasy of John Wayne and a cowboy on a horse riding into the sunset by himself. But that actually historically kind of never existed. And during the time period when we are told that it existed, the late 1890s, early 1900s, what was happening in American cities was quite the opposite of that. Immigrants were coming in from around the world, where they were settling in. They were finding ways to live together with people who were very different from them. This rising union movement, this progressive movement formed. Settlement houses started to happen. Women started to organize. You got the first child labor laws. You got the first idea of a weekend. That was what was really happening, historically speaking, for a majority of people in America while John Wayne was riding off into the sunset on his horse. That dream has always been there under the surface. We need to empower the people who believe in that dream. We need to bring them into leadership, and we need to readjust the American mind, which has been kind of poisoned with fantasies about rising.
As a Disney who is part of the family that have brought us so many of these metaphors and so many of these stories, I know you're doing your bit in creating your own narratives and your own films. The competition, the scales may be a little tilted still in the corporation's direction, but I know you're not done yet. What's your next project?
I haven't decided yet, but I do know that I know that Disney thinks I'm just going to disappear into the sunset and be quiet eventually and get tired of this, but I'm not done with them yet, because I really believe that if you could turn one company especially a company like Disney, you could really make visible what's possible, how different it can be done. A lot has to be done, and I don't think corporations are the key to American vibrancy. But if they don't behave differently, life will not change for a substantial majority of American workers. So I'm going to keep hammering away at that company. I'm not done by a long shot. And I'm going to keep speaking up about tax policy and about income inequality, because it's the issue that lies at the center of every other issue we care about: the environment, racism, women's rights, human rights. Structural inequality is one of the prime firers of that engine.
Disney could be a tipping point. If that one company shifted, and what a perfectly iconic company it would be to shift, it could start a new kind of ethos, perhaps. Do you have specific demands of Bob Iger, the CEO, who is gone and now back? The company's been in a turbulent period. This would be a good time for them to change.
Right. And the share price is damn low right now. They since, I think, 2014, they haven't seen such a low share price. It's
Avatar won't save them.
No, and neither would. So they've had a string of problems. They had a problematic CEO. Bob has come back in. I wish the business press would pay more attention to the poor job he did in succession planning than in the triumphant return because that's the ultimate failure, is poor succession planning. So yeah, Disney is an iconic company. If Disney were to do things differently, if Disney were to say our value is not just the profits that come to our shareholders, but how our people are treated, our effect on the environment, our effect on the American imagination. And they in some ways do that very well, that last part. There are so many companies that would follow them. It just feels like it's so strategically placed in American culture that it really could be an incredible thing. And we're not talking, I'm so tired of the word wokeness, but I think we should embrace it the way that gay people embraced queer. Frankly, I'm woke. I'm awake.
Be woke.
I know the problem with that, but the reason that the right is lashing out against what they call woke capitalism is because they sense that actually there's a real powerful turn that could be made, and it could be led inside of corporations, not by corporate personalities, but by the mass that they represent in terms of working people. And if corporations were to choose to do it differently, were to structure people's lives differently, were to return the fruits of labor to laborers and to owners rather than just to owners, then we would see something very different in this country.
You started by saying that long ago you were afraid to take this kind of a step. You don't seem very afraid now. Do you have a message to maybe some of the other people that are out there in a situation as you were?
Yeah, I get, especially women, they call you tireless and fearless all the time. And I am tireful and I am fearful every damn day. The message is you go ahead and you do it. And like a lot of the things I was fearing have happened. And here I am still sitting here talking to you. So a lot of the time we overcast the fear as a way of not having to do things. I'm all in. I'm 62 years old. I'll be 63 soon. If I don't rest my head for the last time and know that at least some small thing is different because of me, I can't rest peacefully.
Well, thank you for that. We always end the show, or we mostly end the show, by asking our guests about the story they think the future will tell of now. And you've told us a lot of your aspirations, but I would love to hear your answer to that question. What story do you think the future, 25, 50, 100 years from now, will tell of this moment?
We will tell a story of a fever dream that Americans lived from our founding until now. A fever dream of hierarchy, of ranking, that distracted and disabled us from being able to take advantage of the real dream, which is the American dream of interconnectedness, interdependence, and all of the rewards and joys that come with treating every single human being around you as though they are your equal and matter as much as you do.
Abby Disney, thank you so much for your work, for your film, for your courage and your fearfulness, and sharing it with us. You also host a podcast. I encourage people to check it out.
We'll be back. for our fourth season.
It is
All ears with Abigail Disney.
It's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much.
Good to talk to you too.
Family, tradition, history, custom. It's all very hard to go up against, and a whole lot of people have been punished for doing exactly that. I think anxieties about losing traditions are behind a lot of people's anxieties these days about change. But at the same time, a whole lot of change-making is happening precisely because people have started grappling with the histories that led them to this point. A friend of mine, for example, recently inherited some land from a racist grandfather, which she decided to give back to the Native American nation from which it had been stolen centuries back. In so doing, did she run up against some disregard, some resentment, anger in her family? Sure. But she also enriched her own life enormously through the new relationships she's gained as a result. Abby Disney looked at her family history and took what she liked to use against what she didn't, lifted up a part of her family history to challenge the present. And maybe we can all do that. Look closely enough, and there are probably parts of your family history that do represent the values you want to enliven today. I know those exist in my life. There are bits I like, bits I don't like. So how about we thought of biography less as Bible and more as buffet? Take what you like, leave the rest, feel good about the most of it. For more information on this week's show, check out our show notes posted at patreon.com/The LF Show. That's where you'll find links to related articles and past episodes from our archives to explore. Thanks for listening. Stay kind. Stay curious. Till the next time, I'm Laura.